Welcome to Strength of Materials N5. Today's presentation is on shafts. If you are new here, I will advise you to subscribe to this channel. Please leave a like, a comment, because all of that encourages me to continue to produce content of this nature. Let's begin. First, I want to speak about all the equations that you need to become familiar with for you to be able to solve any question you may get in the exam. What I've discovered with students is that sometimes they do not really even understand how to use the equations, and that is why they struggle. Okay, so we're going to look at all the important equations and I am going to explain them in details. And so first, let us look at the polar moment of area. This is similar to the area moment of inertia that you deal with when you are dealing with beams and bending, okay? When we're dealing with shafts, bending is not really the primary concern. The primary concern is actually twisting and torsion, okay? And so for that, you need to know how to get the polar moment of area. And we use the letter J for that. And so if you have a solid shaft, then the equation is given by this, okay? What I mean by a solid shaft, that is a shaft that is not hollow, okay? It's full. When you have a full shaft, a solid shaft, then the polar moment of area is found using this equation. D that you see in this equation is the outer diameter of the shaft, okay? So the polar moment of area will be equal to pi over 32 multiplied by d raised to the power of 4. And we use the letter J for the polar moment of area. So this is the equation for it when you're dealing with a solid shaft. But when you have a hollow shaft, then the equation is this. Now, what I want to draw your attention to is that when you have a hollow shaft, you will remember that you will have the outer diameter of the hollow shaft, and you also have the inner or inside diameter of the hollow shaft. And so when we're dealing with a shaft that is hollow, we will differentiate the diameters using a capital letter. So the outer diameter will be capital D, and the inner diameter, we will refer to that with a small d, okay? So when the shaft is hollow, then the polar moment of area is equal to pi over 32 multiplied by the outer diameter raised to the power of 4 minus the inner diameter raised to the power of 4. Again, I point out to you that when the shaft is hollow, then we use a capital letter to refer to its outer diameter and a small letter to refer to the inner diameter. But when the shaft is solid, it doesn't really matter. If you want, you can use a capital letter for the diameter. But in this presentation, I will be using a small letter for the diameter because it doesn't matter. If the shaft is solid, you only have one diameter. Then we will look at the equation for the torque transmitted, and we know that even from engineering science that torque is equal to the force multiplied by the radius. And again, here this radius is the outer radius, okay? Very important. And then we also have something here that is referred to as the maximum torque. When you're dealing with shafts, there are two types of torques that you need to become familiar with. You have the mean torque and then you have the maximum torque, and this is the equation that relates the two, okay? So the maximum torque is equal to the mean torque multiplied by 1 plus the percentage overload. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Usually you may get a question where they will tell you that the maximum torque exceeds the mean torque by 25%, for instance. So if they say that, it means that the percentage overload is 25%. So for you to get the maximum torque, you will then have to take the mean torque and multiply it by 1 plus 0.25. Okay, so that will be mean torque multiplied by 1.25, okay, because the maximum torque exceeds the mean torque by 25%. That means that the maximum torque is equal to 1.25 multiplied by the mean torque. Okay, so you take 1, you add to that the percentage of a load, but you need to write it as a decimal, and then you multiply the mean torque by that, and that is what gives you the maximum torque. Okay, so this is how you get the maximum torque. If they told you, for instance, that the percentage of a load was 35%, then to get the maximum torque, you will take the mean torque, multiply it by 1,35. Okay, I hope it is clear. If it is not, you can always pause the video here, go back and listen to what I explained a couple of times so that it makes sense to you. Okay, so as far as the torque transmitted is concerned, you need to know these two equations. And then we have the equation for the power transmitted. For anybody who is doing mechanical engineering, by now you are very familiar with this equation. Power is equal to 2 pi nt divided by 60. What is important for you to understand is that the torque in this equation is the mean torque, okay? So whenever you use this equation, remember that the torque here is the mean torque. And of course, we divide by 60 if n is in RPM, okay? If the frequency of rotation here is given in RPM, then you divide by 60. But if it is given in rotations per second, you do not divide by 60, okay? As you can see in this equation here, for the power 2 pi nt, you don't divide by 60 if the value of n that is given to you in the question is in rotations per second, okay? I had a situation where a student was given a value for the rotation, the frequency of rotation in RPS, rotations per second, and they still used this equation here where you have to divide by 60. And of course, all the answers were wrong because they forgot that when n is given in RPS, you don't need to divide by 60. You only divide by 60 if n is given in RPM in the question, okay? Remember that. It's very important. And so this is the equation for the power transmitted. I know many of you are already familiar with that. What is important to note here is that the torque that you have in this equation is the mean torque. It's not the maximum torque. So if you have the maximum torque in the question, you're gonna need to use this equation to find the mean torque. Then you will then plug in the mean torque into this equation to get the power. Now, let us look at the general shaft equation. There is only one, and this is the equation for shafts. When we're dealing with shafts, this is what we call the general shaft equation. Okay, so the maximum torque divided by the polar moment of area is equal to the shear stress divided by the outer radius. This is the outer radius. And this must be equal to the modulus of rigidity multiplied by the angle of twist, okay? Theta is the angle of twist, okay? For those of you who are not familiar with it, I say it again. Theta is the angle of twist, okay? This theta that you see here is the twist angle. And all of that divided by the length of the shaft, okay? And so now, when you are designing for strength, you will use this equality because as you can see here, we have an equality between three terms, okay? This is equal to this and equal to that, okay? But you need to be careful when using this equation, okay? It's either you will use this equality here, that is when you're designing for strength, you use this equality. And of course, this can be simplified to that when you're dealing with a solid shaft. Basically what I did here, I just replaced J by this because this is what J is equal to when you're dealing with a solid shaft, and then you work it out. Of course, the radius here, you will replace it by the diameter divided by 2, okay? And so if you rework this, plugging in this for J and replacing R by D over 2, okay, you end up with this equation, okay, for a solid shaft. But if you do the same thing For a hollow shaft, now J, you will take this expression here, and then again R will be capital D by 2 because R is the outer diameter. Okay, so if you replace that again, you will end up with an expression for this, the maximum torque when you're dealing with a hollow shaft. So all we did is just take this equation and replace J by what J is equal to, and R by the outer diameter divided by 2. Okay, and so when you do that, this equation will simplify to this when you're dealing with a solid shaft, and it will simplify to that when you're dealing with a hollow shaft. Okay, so when they ask you to find the maximum torque, you can use this for a solid shaft, or you can use that for a hollow shaft. These two are not equations that you need to memorize, because you can just work from here and you will eventually get your answer. Okay, you don't really need to memorize these, okay, because they just come from this equation. So you will just start from this equation and already plug in the numbers here, and you will arrive at the final answer. But what I want to remind you of again is that R that you see here is the outer radius, because when you're dealing with a hollow shaft, you may begin to wonder, what is R here? Is it supposed to be the inner radius or the outer radius? When you're dealing with a hollow shaft, R is the outer radius. When you're dealing with a solid shaft, of course, there is no need to worry, because you only have one radius. But with a hollow shaft, this R that you have here is the outer radius. Remember that. Very important. And then when we're designing for rigidity, this is the quality that